67 BC. The Roman general Pompey is staring down an army of 30,000 Albanian warriors in the Caucasus Mountains. These guys are no joke, hardened fighters who've never bowed to anyone. They're dug in, ready to scrap, confident they can bleed the Romans dry in their own backyard. Pompey doesn't attack. Instead, he does something that sounds absolutely insane. He orders his legions to set up camp in full view of the enemy. Not a hidden position, not a defensive posture, right out in the open, like they're setting up for a summer barbecue. And then his soldiers start building. Within 3 days, a full Roman fortress rises from nothing. Walls, towers, ditches, roads, a complete military city constructed with machine-like precision while the Albanians watch in disbelief. On the 4th day, the Albanian king walks out of his camp. No weapons, no army, just him and his generals. And he surrenders everything without a single Roman sword being drawn. What the hell just happened? How did Rome turn construction into a weapon? And why did this same trick work over and over again for 500 years, bringing kings, warriors, and entire nations to their knees without a fight? Stick around, because the answer is way more twisted than you think. Here's the thing about the Roman Empire that nobody really talks about. Yeah, they had killer infantry tactics. Sure, their discipline was legendary, but Rome's most devastating weapon wasn't made of iron or bronze. It was psychological warfare, so sophisticated, so brutally effective, that it made fighting them seem like choosing your own execution method. The Romans understood something that most ancient civilizations missed completely. The costliest battle is the one you have to fight. Every soldier who dies is a farmer who won't harvest crops. Every sword that breaks is silver out of the treasury. Every week spent besieging a city is a week your enemies elsewhere can organize and strike back. So Rome developed a whole playbook of tactics designed to make their enemies quit before the fighting even started. And we're not talking about simple intimidation here. This was a multi-layered, carefully orchestrated system of psychological operations that would make modern military strategists nod in respect. They combined overwhelming displays of force with calculated acts of mercy and brutality. They built their reputation as carefully as they built their roads. They turned surrender into a ritual that actually gave defeated enemies a path to dignity and survival. And they made sure every nation on earth knew exactly what happened to people who resisted versus those who submitted peacefully. The result? An empire that conquered the entire Mediterranean world, most of Europe, and chunks of the Middle East with a fraction of the bloodshed you'd expect. Cities that could have held out for years, surrendering after weeks. Tribes that could have fought to the last man, choosing peace instead. Kings trading their crowns for Roman citizenship without a single legionary breaching their walls. Today, we're breaking down exactly how they pulled this off. We'll look at the specific tactics they used, the psychological principles that made them work, and the real historical examples that prove this wasn't just propaganda. It was Rome's actual strategy for world domination. Because once you see how the Romans weaponized fear, respect, and inevitability, you'll understand why they didn't just conquer the ancient world. They made the ancient world want to be conquered. Let's start with the foundation of everything Rome's reputation. And I'm not talking about vague notions of Roman greatness. I mean the specific, carefully cultivated image that Rome projected to every potential enemy. We are inevitable, we are organized, and we remember everything. The Romans were obsessed with documentation and communication. Every victory got written down, publicized, and spread throughout the known world. They'd send detailed reports back to Rome, which would then be read aloud in the Senate, posted in public forums, and distributed to Roman colonies everywhere. Merchants, travelers, and diplomats carried these stories to every corner of the Mediterranean. But here's the genius part. They didn't just brag about winning. They were incredibly specific about what happened to resistors versus those who surrendered peacefully. Take the example of Carthage. After the Third Punic War in 146 BC, Rome didn't just defeat Carthage, they erased it. The city was burned for 17 days straight. The population was killed or enslaved. The land was allegedly salted, so nothing would grow there again. Now, historians debate whether the salting actually happened, but here's what matters. People believed it happened. That story spread everywhere. But at the same time, Rome was showcasing cities that had surrendered peacefully and prospered under Roman rule. Places like Massilia, modern-day Marseille, became wealthy trading hubs with Roman protection. Their citizens kept their customs, their gods, their local governments. They just paid taxes and provided troops when Rome needed them. The message was crystal clear. Resist us and face annihilation. Join us and prosper. And Rome made sure everyone knew both options in vivid detail. They also weaponized their engineering capabilities as a form of psychological warfare. When Roman legions showed up, they didn't just camp randomly. They built fortified camps every single night, even if they were only staying for one evening. These weren't crude wooden barriers. These were sophisticated military installations with measured layouts, defensive ditches, palisade walls, and organized internal roads. Enemy scouts would watch Roman soldiers transform an empty field into a fortress in about 3 hours. Every legion could do this. Every time. Without fail. The message this sent was terrifying. We are so organized, so well trained, so resource rich, that we can build a defensible city faster than you can decide on a battle plan. And here's where it gets really psychological. The Romans understood that uncertainty is often scarier than known danger. So they made sure their enemies knew exactly what Roman military capabilities looked like, the formations, the equipment, the tactics. But they kept their strategic thinking opaque. You might know that a Roman legion had about 5,000 men organized into cohorts and centuries. You might know they used the gladius for close combat and javelins for ranged attacks. But you wouldn't know which tactics they'd use in your specific situation, how many legions were coming, or whether the general you faced was the merciful type or the make an example type. This combination of transparent capability and opaque intention kept enemies off balance. They knew Rome could crush them, they just didn't know if Rome would choose to or offer terms instead. The Romans also exploited what modern psychologists call social proof. When one tribe or city-state surrendered, Rome made sure all their neighbors knew about it. They'd grant the surrendered people visible privileges, parade their former leaders as honored guests rather than prisoners, and showcase the peace and prosperity that came from joining the Roman system. This created a bandwagon effect. If your neighboring tribe just got absorbed into Rome and they're suddenly building aqueducts and trading with the entire Mediterranean, your own people start asking why you're choosing poverty and war over prosperity and peace. And the Romans were patient. They understood that reputation building takes time. But once established, it does the heavy lifting for you. By the late Republic and early Empire periods, Rome wasn't just a city or even an empire, it was a concept. It meant organization, inevitability, and the weight of history itself bearing down on you. When a Roman army appeared on your border, you weren't just facing those specific legions. You were facing centuries of Roman victories, the memory of every city that resisted and fell, and the knowledge that Rome had outlasted every enemy it had ever faced. That's not just intimidating, that's existentially terrifying in a way that makes surrender seem like wisdom rather than cowardice. Now, let's talk about one of Rome's most brilliant innovations, deditio. This was the formal Roman surrender ritual, and it's way more sophisticated than you'd think. See, most ancient cultures had pretty binary approaches to defeat. You either won and took everything, or you lost and got slaughtered or enslaved. There wasn't much middle ground, but Rome realized that if you give people a dignified way to surrender, one that doesn't completely destroy their honor, they're way more likely to take it. Deditio was that mechanism. It was a formal, ritualized process where a defeated enemy could surrender themselves completely to Roman authority. And the key word there is completely. This wasn't negotiation. This wasn't a treaty between equals. This was total submission, with the understanding that Rome would then decide your fate. Here's how it worked. The defeated leaders would approach the Roman commander unarmed. They'd formally declare that they were surrendering themselves, their people, their land, their possessions, everything, into Roman hands. The The Roman commander would accept this surrender in a formal ceremony. And then here's the fascinating part. Rome would usually give most of it back. The defeated people would get to keep their land, their homes, their local customs and gods. They'd become part of the Roman system, sure. They'd pay taxes and provide military support. But they wouldn't be wiped out or enslaved. Their leaders often kept their positions, just now operating under Roman authority. This created a bizarre psychological dynamic. By surrendering everything, you got to keep almost everything. By admitting complete defeat, you avoided actual destruction. It was submission theater that led to practical continuity. The genius of this system was that it gave defeated enemies a psychological escape hatch. Surrender wasn't admitting you were weak or cowardly. It was making a wise decision to join the obviously superior Roman system. It wasn't betraying your people, it was saving them from annihilation. Rome even developed different levels of alliance and citizenship that made this integration path more appealing. You could become a friend of Rome, amicus, an allied state, foederati, or eventually even gain Roman citizenship. Each level came with specific rights and privileges. And the Romans were smart about showcasing success stories. They'd point to the Aedui in Gaul, who became Rome's favored allies and prospered massively. They'd highlight former enemies, who now served as auxiliary troops, gaining wealth and status through Roman military service. They'd parade former kings who'd become Roman senators. The message was consistent. The Roman system has room for you, and the people who join it do better than those who resist it. But deditio wasn't just carrot. There was plenty of stick too. The ritual only worked if you did it before Rome had to actually besiege you or fight a major battle. Once Roman soldiers started dying to take your city, all bets were off. The Romans had a brutal rule for cities taken by storm. Everything inside was fair game for the soldiers. Population enslaved, wealth plundered, buildings burned. This wasn't just random violence, it was calculated policy designed to make the deditio option look really, really good by comparison. So you had this ticking clock. Surrender early through deditio and keep almost everything. Wait too long and lose literally everything. The psychological pressure this created was immense, and Rome made sure everyone knew the stories. The city that surrendered before the siege engines arrived and kept its autonomy, the one that waited until the walls were breached and ceased to exist. The contrast was stark and intentional. There's a famous example from the Jewish War. The city of Sepphoris in Galilee surrendered to Rome immediately when the rebellion started. The Romans rewarded them with peace, protection, and prosperity. Meanwhile, Jerusalem resisted until 70 AD, and the result was catastrophic. The temple destroyed, hundreds of thousands killed or enslaved, the city itself devastated. Now, the Jewish rebels had legitimate religious and political reasons for resisting, and their courage was extraordinary. But from Rome's psychological warfare perspective, the contrast between Sepphoris and Jerusalem was a perfect teaching moment for every other potential rebel. See what cooperation gets you. See what resistance costs? The deditio system also solved a practical problem for Rome: garrison requirements. If you conquer people who hate you, you need tons of troops to keep them subdued. But if you conquer people who voluntarily submitted and then been treated relatively well, they'll often police themselves. Some even become enthusiastic supporters of the system. This is how Rome managed to control a massive empire with a relatively small number of legions. Most of their subjects weren't held down by force. They were integrated into a system that, while unfair and exploitative in many ways, seemed better than the alternatives. And here's the darkest brilliance of deditio. It made conquered peoples complicit in their own conquest. By formally surrendering and accepting Roman authority, they performed an act that psychologically committed them to the Roman system. They'd made a choice, even if that choice was made under duress. Modern psychology calls this the escalation of commitment. Once you've made a decision and publicly committed to it, you're psychologically invested in making it work. The Romans understood this instinctively, centuries before anyone studied it scientifically. So deditio wasn't just a surrender mechanism. It was a psychological tool that turned defeat into partnership, resistance into collaboration, and enemies into allies, all while making it seem like the defeated party was making a rational, even wise decision. That's not just clever. That's terrifyingly sophisticated for an ancient civilization. All right, let's get into the really spectacular stuff. How Rome used demonstrations of overwhelming force to break enemy morale before fighting even started. Remember that opening story about Pompeii in Albania? That wasn't a one-off trick. That was standard Roman operating procedure refined over centuries into an art form. The Romans understood that your eyes can defeat you faster than any sword. When they wanted to intimidate an enemy into surrender, they'd orchestrate elaborate displays designed to showcase their organizational superiority, technological advantage, and sheer unstoppable momentum. Let's break down the specific techniques they used. First, the camp construction we already mentioned. But it's worth going deeper here because the psychological impact was layered. When a Roman legion built their marching camp, they weren't just creating fortifications, they were performing a ritual of dominance. Every camp followed the exact same layout, no matter where in the empire it was built. Same grid pattern of roads, same position for the commander's tent, same placement of units, same defensive perimeter. Enemy scouts watching this would realize they weren't facing an army, they were facing a machine. And the speed was deliberately intimidating. Roman soldiers could march 20 to 25 miles, arrive at a new location, and have a fortified camp built before sunset. Every soldier knew their exact job. There was no confusion, no debate, no wasted motion, just synchronized execution of a plan they'd practiced hundreds of times. For tribal enemies who might take days to organize a war council and decide on strategy, watching Romans build a fortress in an afternoon was psychologically devastating. It said, "We are so far ahead of you organizationally that comparison is meaningless." But camp building was just the beginning. The Romans also weaponized their engineering capabilities through siege works that were designed as much for psychological impact as military necessity. At the siege of Alesia in 52 BC, Julius Caesar built 2 complete rings of fortifications around the Gallic fortress. The inner ring to keep the defenders in, the outer ring to keep reinforcements out. Combined, these fortifications stretched for over 25 miles and included walls, ditches, towers, traps, and obstacles. The Gallic defenders and their allies could watch this massive construction project happening in real time. Day by day, the noose tightened. The message was unmistakable. We have so many soldiers, so much material, and so much organizational capability that we can build an entire siege city around your entire army. Your reinforcements won't save you. Your fortress won't save you. Nothing will save you except surrender. And you know what? It worked. After the siege, Vercingetorix, one of history's great warriors who'd united the Gallic tribes in Rome's most serious challenge in Gaul, surrendered himself to Caesar to spare his men. The Romans also used their engineering to demonstrate an almost supernatural ability to overcome natural obstacles. Rivers? They'd bridge them in days. Mountains? They'd build roads over them. Swamps? They'd drain them or build causeways through them. When Trajan conquered Dacia, modern Romania, his engineers built a massive stone bridge across the Danube River, one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world. This wasn't just for logistics. It was a statement. Natural barriers mean nothing to us. Geography won't protect you. We'll just remake the landscape to suit our needs. The psychological impact of watching an enemy reshape the earth itself to reach you can't be overstated. Rome also used military parades and displays as psychological weapons. When trying to intimidate a potential enemy, they'd stage elaborate reviews of their troops. Thousands of soldiers in perfect formation, moving in synchronized precision, displaying standardized equipment and training. Ancient sources describe barbarian leaders watching Roman military parades and just giving up on the spot. They'd never seen anything like that level of organization and uniformity. Their warriors were brave and skilled, sure, but they fought as individuals or small groups. The Romans fought as a single, coordinated entity. There's a great example from when the Parthian Empire captured the Roman general Crassus in 53 BC. Later, Roman delegations would visit Parthia, and the Parthians would stage elaborate displays of their cavalry and archery. The Romans, in turn, would stage displays of their infantry formations and camp-building abilities. Each side was trying to intimidate the other without fighting. The Parthians showed speed and mobility. The Romans showed organization and inevitable grinding advance. Different strengths, but the same psychological warfare principle. Look what we can do. Do you really want to fight this? The Romans also used calculated displays of wealth and resources to break enemy morale. They'd sometimes have supply trains deliberately take longer routes, where enemies could see them endless wagon trains of food, weapons, and equipment. The message: we have so much stuff that will never run out. You're not fighting an army, you're fighting the resources of the entire Mediterranean world. And they'd combine all these elements into overwhelming sensory experiences. Imagine you're a tribal leader contemplating resistance. Roman legions arrive and immediately start building a fortress. Their camp is huge, way bigger than your entire settlement. You watch them practice drills with mechanical precision. You see supply wagons arriving constantly. You hear their war horns and signals coordinating thousands of men. At night, their camp is lit up with countless fires, organized in perfect rows. Your scouts report that there are more camps nearby. This isn't even their whole force. Merchants tell you stories about what happened to the last tribe that resisted. Roman envoys arrive offering generous surrender terms if you submit now, with implicit threats about what happens if you don't. Every sense, every source of information is telling you the same thing. Resistance is suicide. Cooperation is survival. That's not fighting, that's psychological demolition. And the craziest part? Most of the time, Rome didn't even need to deploy these tactics at full scale. Their reputation did the work for them. By the late Republic and Empire periods, just the news that Roman legions were coming was enough to start surrender negotiations. The Romans had successfully weaponized their own reputation. They'd turned being Roman into a form of psychological warfare that operated independently of actual military action. That's next-level thinking for an ancient civilization, and it's a huge part of why they dominated for so long. Now we get to the really dark, sophisticated part of Roman psychological warfare, their strategic use of both mercy and brutality, calibrated specifically to maximize psychological impact and minimize future resistance. The Romans understood something that modern behaviorists would later formalize. Variable reinforcement is the most powerful form of conditioning. If your enemy never knows whether they'll face mercy or annihilation, they can't develop a consistent resistance strategy. Let me give you a concrete example. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, documented in his own writings, shows this principle in action over and over. When the Germanic tribes under Ariovistus threatened Gaul, Caesar crushed them militarily, but let survivors flee back across the Rhine. Message: stay on your side of the river and we're cool. When the Helvetii tribe tried to migrate across Roman territory, Caesar defeated them, but then allowed them to return to their homeland and rebuild. Message: respect our borders and we'll let you live in peace. But when the Nervi tribe launched a surprise attack that nearly destroyed Caesar's legions, his response was genocidal. The tribe was effectively annihilated. Message: treachery means extinction. And when the city of Uxellodunum resisted even after the rest of Gaul had surrendered, Caesar had all the defenders' hands cut off and released them to wander Gaul as living warnings. Message: pointless resistance has consequences worse than death. See the pattern? Caesar was carefully calibrating his response based on what message he wanted to send and to whom. He wasn't randomly cruel or randomly merciful. He was using both as tools to shape future behavior. The Romans developed a whole philosophy around this called severitas and clementia, severity and mercy. Both were considered virtues, and a good Roman commander needed to know when to deploy each. Clementia, mercy, was used when the enemy surrendered early through proper deditio. The enemy was strategically important as a future ally. Mercy would encourage other enemies to surrender. The enemy's resistance was based on misunderstanding rather than treachery. Severity. was used when the enemy broke agreements or betrayed trust. Continued resistance after defeat needed to be discouraged. An example needed to be made to intimidate other potential rebels. The enemy had killed Roman citizens or soldiers unnecessarily. The key was that both responses were publicized extensively. Every act of mercy was proclaimed as evidence of Roman magnanimity and civilization. Every act of brutality was described in horrifying detail as a warning. Take the case of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in Britain. When he died, he left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman emperor, hoping this would protect his people. Instead, Roman officials seized everything, beat his widow Boudica, and raped his daughters. Big mistake. Boudica led a massive revolt that destroyed several Roman cities and killed thousands of Romans. The eventual Roman response was absolutely brutal. The rebels were hunted down and slaughtered, the Iceni territory was devastated, and Boudica herself died, possibly by suicide rather than be captured. But here's the thing, Rome then switched to mercy. The new Roman governor, Gaius Julius Agricola, implemented fair policies, protected the Britons from corrupt officials, and worked to integrate them into the Roman system peacefully. The combined message to other British tribes was clear. Rebellion leads to annihilation, but cooperation leads to prosperity. Choose wisely. The Romans also used mercy strategically to split enemy coalitions. When facing multiple enemies allied against them, they'd offer generous terms to the weakest or most wavering members. This created distrust and competition among the allies. Why should we keep fighting when Rome is offering those guys peace and favorable terms? Maybe we should take a deal too before Rome's mood changes. This tactic worked brilliantly during the Social War when Rome's Italian allies rebelled. Rome selectively offered citizenship and favorable terms to some rebels while crushing others. The rebel coalition fragmented as different groups scrambled to get the best deal, and Rome defeated them piecemeal. Another layer of this strategy involved targeted assassination and intimidation of resistance leaders, while offering rewards to collaborators. Rome would simultaneously hunt down and execute rebel leaders while showering wealth and status on local leaders who cooperated. This created a ruthless selection pressure. If you were a local leader, resistance meant you and your family would be targeted for elimination. Cooperation meant wealth, status, and protection. Most people chose cooperation. The Romans also understood the power of spectacle in communicating both mercy and brutality. When they wanted to show mercy, they'd stage elaborate ceremonies of reconciliation, with the defeated leader honored, feasted, and publicly embraced by the Roman commander. When they wanted to show brutality, they'd stage public executions, enslavements, and destructions that everyone could witness. The crucifixions along the Appian Way after Spartacus's revolt, 6,000 crucified slaves lining the road from Rome to Capua, were meant to be seen and remembered. And here's maybe the most psychologically sophisticated aspect. The Romans made sure that both mercy and brutality were framed as the natural consequences of choices the defeated people made, not arbitrary Roman cruelty. Surrendered early? That was wise, so you get mercy. Resisted beyond reason? That was foolish, so you get brutality. The responsibility for the outcome was placed on the defeated people themselves. This is incredibly manipulative because it makes Roman violence seem like justice rather than conquest. We didn't destroy your city because we're cruel conquerors. We destroyed it because you made the foolish choice to resist. This is on you. Modern psychologists would recognize this as a form of victim blaming, but it was devastatingly effective at undermining resistance morale. If your own destruction is framed as the consequence of your own bad choices, it's harder to maintain the righteous anger needed to keep fighting. The Romans also varied their approach based on cultural context. Against enemies who valued honor and glory in death, they'd offer honorable surrender terms. Against enemies who valued practical benefits, they'd emphasize the wealth and opportunities in the Roman system. Against enemies who valued independence, they'd offer autonomous client-state status. They weren't using a one-size-fits-all approach. They were tailoring their psychological warfare to the specific cultural values and fears of each enemy. And perhaps most importantly, the Romans were patient. They understood that breaking resistance psychology sometimes takes years of consistent messaging. They combined small acts of mercy with occasional demonstrations of overwhelming force, gradually shifting the psychological landscape until resistance seemed irrational. By the time of the Roman Empire, this system was so refined that most provinces stayed peaceful not because of massive garrison forces, but because the population had internalized the logic of Roman dominance. Resistance seemed futile, cooperation seemed sensible, and the Roman system seemed inevitable. That's not just conquest. That's psychological colonization, making the conquered people themselves believe that Roman rule is the natural, rational order of things. So here we are. We've walked through Rome's complete psychological warfare playbook, the reputation factory, the surrender ritual, the overwhelming force displays, and the calculated balance of mercy and brutality. But here's the question that should be rattling around in your head right now. Did this actually work as well as Roman sources claim? Or is this just propaganda? The answer is both. Yes, it's partially propaganda. The Romans absolutely exaggerated their successes and downplayed their failures. But the core strategy was real, and the evidence is overwhelming. Think about it this way. Rome controlled an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to the Rhine. They did this with a standing military force of only about 300,000 men at their peak. That's roughly the size of the modern US Marine Corps, trying to occupy a quarter of the entire planet. There's no way they could have done that through pure military force. The numbers don't work. They needed most of their subjects to be self-policing, and that required a level of psychological integration that only their sophisticated warfare tactics could achieve. And we can see the system's effectiveness in what happened when it broke down. When Rome started becoming more consistently brutal and less strategically merciful in the late empire, rebellions increased. When the reputation for inevitability cracked, enemies became bolder. The psychological machinery that had sustained the empire started failing, and military force alone couldn't compensate. The fall of Rome wasn't primarily a military defeat, it was a psychological one. Once people stopped believing in Roman inevitability, once the cost-benefit calculation of cooperation versus resistance shifted, the empire's days were numbered. But the techniques Rome developed didn't die with the empire. Modern military strategists still study Roman psychological warfare. The concept of shock and awe, overwhelming displays of force designed to break enemy morale, is straight from the Roman playbook. Psychological operations, strategic communication, reputation management, all of these have roots in Roman practice. Even modern diplomacy borrows from Didio. The idea that defeated enemies can be integrated into the victor's system rather than destroyed, that surrender can be honorable and beneficial rather than shameful. These concepts that we take for granted in modern international relations were refined by Rome. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This stuff works. It worked for Rome for 500 years. It's worked for empires and nations since. The psychological principles underlying Roman tactics, social proof, variable reinforcement, strategic reputation management, creating dignified exit ramps from conflict. These are hardwired into human psychology. We like to think we're rational beings who make logical decisions based on facts. But the Romans understood that we're actually emotional beings who rationalize decisions based on fear, hope, social pressure, and perceived inevitability. They didn't just conquer territories, they conquered minds. They made resistance seem irrational and cooperation seem wise. They turned enemies into allies by making alliance seem like the smart choice rather than the cowardly one. That's the real genius of Roman psychological warfare. It didn't just defeat enemies, it converted them. It turned conquest into collaboration and made the conquered grateful for the privilege of joining the Roman system. Is that manipulative? Absolutely. Is it cynical? Without question. But is it effective? History speaks for itself. Rome built an empire that lasted a millennium and shaped Western civilization forever. Not because their soldiers were the best fighters, though they were damn good, but because they understood that the strongest fortress is the one inside your enemy's head. The belief that resistance is futile, that cooperation is wisdom, that the current order is inevitable. Break those beliefs and empires crumble. Maintain those beliefs and empires endure. That's the tactic that made enemies surrender without fighting. Not swords, not siege engines, not numerical superiority, though all of those helped. The real weapon was the carefully constructed psychological reality that made fighting Rome seem like choosing a slower, more painful version of the same inevitable outcome. And once you see how they did it, you start seeing the same patterns everywhere in history, politics, and even modern life. The tools change, the scale changes, but the psychological principles remain the same. Rome didn't just conquer the ancient world. They wrote the handbook for how to make people conquer themselves. If you made it this far, you've just completed a masterclass in psychological warfare from history's most successful empire. But here's the thing, Rome had dozens of other tactics, strategies, and innovations that changed warfare forever. We're just getting started on this channel. Next time, we're diving into the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal pulled off the most perfect tactical victory in military history and slaughtered 8 Roman legions in a single afternoon. How did Rome survive that? And how did they eventually beat the man who seemed unbeatable? Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss it. Drop a comment telling me which ancient warfare tactic you want us to cover next. And if you learned something new today, share this with someone who needs to know that history is way more badass than they remember from school. This is Warlords and Kingdoms. Thanks for watching. Now, go forth and conquer, preferably without fighting.